August 18, 1945. The Pacific lay still, bruised by months of thunder and fire. A single Zero fighter drifted above the island of Saipan, its engine coughing smoke like a dying beast. The war was over. Tokyo had announced surrender 3 days earlier, but in the lonely cockpit of that plane, Lieutenant Toshiro Kobayashi hadn't heard the Emperor's voice. His radio was shattered, his squadron scattered. For him, the war still breathed in the whine of propellers and the scent of gasoline. Below him stretched the ruins of an American airfield, pockmarked runways, heaps of twisted fuselage, and trucks that shimmered in the tropical heat. He circled once, desperate, scanning for a place to land. Then his eyes caught movement near a cluster of tents. A man on horseback, wearing a tattered Stetson hat, reins loose, a cigarette dangling from his mouth. The image seemed impossible. Kobayashi blinked hard. An American cowboy on a Pacific Island battlefield. He throttled down. The Zero's propeller sliced slower and slower until it stuttered. With no fuel left, he glided in low, clipped a fence, and slammed into the dirt. Metal screeched. Sand exploded. When the dust settled, the young pilot crawled out, trembling. He expected a rifle aimed at his chest. Instead, the cowboy approached calmly, dusting his jeans, spurs clinking. That man was Corporal Earl McCready of the U.S. Marine Corps, though his heart still belonged to the cattle ranches of Texas. Before the war, he had roped steer, fixed fences, and sung under open skies. Now he was part of a military police unit, tasked with securing the island. His revolver hung low, his posture easy, but his eyes stayed sharp. McCready studied the dazed pilot before him. The young Japanese man raised both hands, voice breaking in English. "No shoot." "What, finish?" The cowboy gave a slow nod, then spat into the dust. "Yeah, son. It's done." In that strange instant, two men who should have been enemies, there was only silence and wind. The war that had turned oceans red had funneled down to this absurd, human moment. A samurai-trained flyer surrendering not to generals or flags, but to a ranch hand from Abilene. To understand the gravity of that meeting, one must step back 3 years, when Saipan was the beating heart of Japan's Pacific defense. In June 1944, American Marines stormed its beaches under blistering artillery. The island was vital. From its runways, B-29 superfortresses could reach Tokyo. The Japanese defenders, 30,000 strong, were told that capture meant disgrace worse than death. For weeks, the battle raged through sugarcane fields and cliffs. Japanese tanks burned, American flamethrowers carved trenches of fire, and civilians leapt from cliffs in despair. When the smoke cleared, nearly all Japanese soldiers had perished. Yet scattered remnants, pilots, engineers, and officers, hid in caves, refusing to believe the empire had fallen. Kobayashi was one of them. He had been stationed at Tinian, flying reconnaissance over the approaching American fleet. When his base fell, he escaped north in a battered Zero, landing in jungle clearings, scavenging fuel from abandoned depots. By August 1945, he had become a ghost pilot, drifting between clouds of disbelief and duty. To him, surrender was dishonor, capture unimaginable. Meanwhile, on the American side, the mood had shifted. Hiroshima and Nagasaki lay in ruins. Japan's radio broadcast on August 15th announced the Emperor's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. Across the Pacific, Marines relaxed their grips, hoping the nightmare had ended. But for soldiers like McCready, stationed on isolated islands, confusion lingered. No one knew which Japanese units had heard the news, or which would fight to the death rather than yield. When McCready saw the falling Zero, he didn't fire. Something about the erratic descent felt less like an attack and more like desperation. He galloped toward the crash site, dust trailing behind his horse, shouting to nearby troops to hold fire. They watched as the pilot stumbled out, waving a white cloth torn from his sleeve. The encounter unfolded under the fading afternoon sun. McCready dismounted slowly, hands open, voice calm. He told the others to stay back. The young pilot looked exhausted, his uniform shredded, his face streaked with oil and sweat. McCready reached into his pocket, pulled out a small canteen and offered water. Kobayashi hesitated, then drank, coughing between gulps. Neither man could fully understand the other's words, yet something passed between them, a mutual exhaustion that transcended language. The cowboy's easy manner dissolved the fear that had driven the pilot for years. He unstrapped the pistol from his belt, and laid it gently in the dust. Witnesses later recalled the surreal sight: an American on horseback escorting a Japanese pilot through the ruins of Saipan, the prisoner still bowing repeatedly, the captor tipping his hat in return. Nearby Marines stared, uncertain whether to laugh or salute. It was war reduced to its most absurdly human core, honor meeting humility in the no-man's land between victory and surrender. Military reports would later document the incident briefly, buried among routine surrender logs. Yet veterans who served alongside McCready remembered it vividly. They said the Texan treated the pilot like a lost kid who'd wandered too far from home. In his tent that evening, McCready reportedly told his unit, "Fella looked more scared than any steer I ever broke." For Kobayashi, captivity brought relief and shame in equal measure. He had expected humiliation, perhaps death. Instead, he found cigarettes, rations, and quiet respect. The Americans photographed him beside his wrecked Zero, the once deadly machine now a husk. To them, he was just another sign the war had finally ended. To him, it was the moment he realized the world he fought for no longer existed. The following morning, a transport truck carried him to the island's detention center. McCready rode alongside on his horse for part of the way, humming a country tune. The pilot watched, bewildered by the rhythm, unsure whether it was a song of mourning or peace. Later, when interrogators confirmed that Kobayashi's unit had indeed lost all communication after June, they realized how many isolated pockets of Japanese resistance remained scattered across the Pacific, men still waiting for orders from an empire that had already surrendered. The encounter on Saipan became one of several peculiar incidents during those final days, each a reminder that wars rarely end cleanly. In the months to come, newspapers would print tales of soldiers emerging from jungles years later, unaware the conflict had ended. But among those many stories, the one of the pilot and the cowboy stood out. A paradox of war transformed into a parable of mercy. McCready never spoke publicly about the event. When he returned home to Texas in 1946, he resumed ranching, his medals tucked in a drawer. Yet neighbors recalled that sometimes, late at night, they'd see him staring west across the plains, as if listening for distant engines fading into silence. And somewhere in Japan, years later, Kobayashi would tell his children that he had once met a man who wore no uniform of hatred, only a hat full of dust and sunlight. The story of their meeting might have ended there, as an odd footnote in the archives of surrender, but hidden beneath its surface was something far larger, a mystery of how two enemies could recognize their shared humanity amid ruins. What made this encounter possible? How did a lone cowboy come to be on that battlefield at the precise moment a Japanese pilot sought to surrender? The answer lay deeper, in the strange improvised chaos of the final Pacific days, when command lines frayed, radios failed, and the boundaries between soldier and civilian blurred. And in that confusion, one man's courage to act with decency would echo far beyond the war itself. In the weeks before that fateful meeting, chaos ruled the Pacific. Between bombings, ceasefire orders, and shifting command lines, small islands like Saipan became zones of suspended war, neither fully hostile nor fully peaceful. American patrols swept jungles for holdouts, while Japanese survivors, emaciated and terrified, clung to outdated codes of honor. Somewhere within that fog of confusion, the path of a wandering cowboy and a stranded pilot began to converge. Corporal Earl McCready hadn't been assigned to Saipan by chance. In late 1945, the U.S. Marine Corps needed men who could move fast across rugged terrain to gather prisoners and protect reconstruction teams. McCready, with his experience breaking wild horses in Texas, fit the role perfectly. He'd been attached to a provisional mounted patrol unit, a rarity in the modern war, responsible for scouting supply routes too uneven for jeeps. His commanding officer described him as a throwback to the frontier, a man who could track footprints through dust and sense ambush before it came. The horses came from army stock captured on Guam, small and sturdy breeds that could endure the tropical heat. McCready rode one named Daisy, temperamental, loyal, and nervous around aircraft engines. When the Zero crashed that day, Daisy reared and snorted, and McCready instinctively tightened the reins, steadying her like he'd done 100 times back home. He could never have guessed that his skill with a horse would bring him face to face with a pilot from the other side of the Pacific. On the Japanese end, Lieutenant Toshiro Kobayashi's story was one of desperation, shaped by technology's slow decay. His Mitsubishi A6M0 had once been Japan's pride, light, maneuverable, deadly. But by 1945, the legendary fighter was obsolete. Its frame of aluminum alloy, once unmatched in agility, was now brittle and scarred. The engine, a Nakajima Sakai 12-cylinder radial, sputtered at high altitude. He had patched it with scavenged parts, coaxing it into flight for one final reconnaissance mission. The aircraft's radio transmitter had burned out months earlier, leaving him stranded in silence. He had taken off from a jungle clearing on the morning of August 18th, carrying a half-empty fuel tank and a fading sense of duty. Beneath his seat, he kept a small family photo wrapped in oilcloth, a wife and newborn daughter he hadn't seen since 1943. To surrender was unthinkable, yet to die alone in the clouds was worse. When the Zero's gauges fell into the red and the sea wind tore at his canopy, he realized that fate had already chosen his course. The peculiar circumstances that brought Macready and Kobayashi together were born of logistical improvisation. With Saipan transitioning from battlefield to forward base, American engineers had begun restoring its infrastructure. Runways were cleared of wreckage, fuel depots rebuilt, and makeshift communication towers erected by the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees. It was these same engineers who kept the mounted patrols supplied, running cables and generators where vehicles couldn't reach. Without their work, Macready would never have been patrolling that sector. When the crash occurred, the first reports that filtered through the chain of command described an enemy aircraft attempting surrender under unclear conditions. Such phrasing reflected the strange uncertainty of that week. The Emperor's surrender broadcast had been transmitted via shortwave, translated and rebroadcast multiple times. Some Japanese units heard it clearly. Others dismissed it as propaganda. The Pacific's patchwork of broken transmitters left thousands in limbo. Kobayashi was merely one of many stranded between worlds, loyal to orders that no longer existed. The Zero's descent onto Saipan's soil wasn't just a stroke of luck. It reflected the collapsing state of Japan's wartime communication network. Allied bombing raids had crippled long-range transmission stations across the Marianas and the Ryukyus. Naval encryption codes were obsolete, and even pilots still active in August 1945 often relied on civilian radio frequencies scavenged from abandoned sets. Historians later noted that the Japanese military had over-relied on centralized coordination, while the Americans thrived through decentralization, independent initiative guided by radio-linked units. It was that flexibility that made men like Macready dangerous, individuals capable of acting without waiting for orders. The Marines on Saipan respected Macready because he trusted instinct over regulation. When his horse bolted toward the crash site, no one dared stop him. The others expected an ambush, but Macready's years on the range had taught him something about fear. It made men predictable. He read the pilot's body language the way he once read stampeding cattle. Panic, not aggression. That intuition saved both their lives. Later that evening, the Zero's wreckage was examined by Navy technicians. They found bullet holes patched with flattened soup cans, wiring spliced by hand, and gauges held together with cloth tape. To the Americans, it was a tragic symbol of Japan's exhaustion. To the Japanese, it would have been a mark of resilience, proof that their warriors fought uneven. When the empire itself was crumbling, documents from the Marine detachment on Saipan noted that the pilot appeared confused regarding cessation of hostilities. He reportedly asked several times whether the emperor still lived. When told the war had ended, he broke down in silence, neither relieved nor grief-stricken, only hollow. Macready stayed with him through the night, sharing rations, translating what little they could through gestures. It was said that he handed the pilot a small silver locket containing a photo of his own sister, explaining in slow words, "Family's all that matters now." Behind the small drama of two men lay the machinery of empire winding to a halt. Across the Pacific, Allied forces scrambled to coordinate mass surrenders. In the Philippines, entire garrisons laid down arms under white sheets. On isolated islands, however, many refused to believe the news. Without functional radios, their commanders were ghosts, their orders eternal. It would take years, sometimes decades for them to come home. Kobayashi's surrender, though minor in scale, represented a turning point. It demonstrated that mercy could pierce through indoctrination more effectively than gunfire. American command recorded the incident not as combat, but as voluntary capitulation facilitated by local personnel. That bureaucratic phrasing couldn't capture the essence of what had happened, that the spirit of a cowboy, shaped by a culture of independence, had met the rigid honor of a samurai, and for one fragile moment, both gave way to humanity. Technical analysts who studied the Zero afterward noted its make, an A6M5 model with shortened wings, designed for better dive performance. Its armament of two 20mm Type 99 cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns had been removed, perhaps to save weight or as a gesture of surrender. Its range, originally over 1,100 miles, had been reduced to less than half by fuel leaks. The discovery highlighted how far Japan's air power had declined. Engineers from Grumman and Lockheed, reviewing captured aircraft, later wrote that such improvisation reflected the desperate skill of pilots fighting beyond the limits of logistics. In the days that followed, Macready's unit received orders to round up additional stragglers. The Marines often found weapons buried in sand or hidden beneath palm leaves, but none of them encountered another surrender like Kobayashi's. Most remaining Japanese either took their own lives or melted into the jungles. The cowboy and his horse remained an anomaly in an ocean of violence, a living contradiction to the war's final fury. Years later, historians would debate whether Macready's mounted patrol even existed as an official formation, or whether it was an ad hoc arrangement improvised from leftover cavalry doctrine. Whatever its origin, the truth remained that he rode where no jeeps could travel, patrolling a land still trembling from invasion. His encounter became a symbol among Marines, proof that in the dying light of war, decency sometimes arrived not by command but by instinct. Yet beneath the surface of this quiet surrender lay deeper questions. How many others never got the chance to lay down arms? How many never met their own cowboy? As the Pacific shifted from war to occupation, stories like theirs faded into the margins of history. Still, one detail persisted. When the surrender was processed, Macready refused to hand over the pilot's sword to the quartermaster. He cleaned it himself, wrapped it in cloth, and kept it safe until repatriation officers could return it to Kobayashi months later. To some, it was a simple act of respect. To others, it was the last gesture of chivalry in a war that had long forgotten the word. The legend of the cowboy and the pilot might have remained a rumor whispered in veterans' bars, but it would soon ripple outward. In post-war Japan, reports of humane treatment by individual Americans challenged years of propaganda depicting the enemy as monsters. Macready's act, small as it seemed, became part of a greater shift in perception, one that would help bridge two nations shattered by fire. But the full weight of their story, and the strange aftershocks it created, would only be felt in the years that followed, when their paths crossed once more under a new banner, not of war, but of reconciliation. The war's smoke drifted into memory, but its shadows clung to the hearts of those who survived it. In 1946, the Pacific Islands began to transform from killing grounds into waypoints of peace. Airstrips once lined with bombers now hosted cargo planes bringing food, medicine, and correspondence. Engineers rebuilt what had been broken, and soldiers became diplomats overnight. Among them was a quiet Marine corporal from Texas, whose name had already faded from official reports, but not from the men who'd served beside him. Earl Macready stayed behind for 6 months after Japan's formal surrender. He worked with the military police detachment, overseeing the transfer of prisoners of war, guiding convoys, maintaining order. Yet his thoughts often returned to the small airfield where the pilot had landed, the spot where history itself had paused to catch its breath. Each time he rode past it, he saw the outline of the wrecked Zero still etched in the soil. Half a world away, Lieutenant Toshiro Kobayashi found himself in a prisoner processing camp near Guam. The Americans treated him fairly. Rations, medical care, interrogation through translators, but the shame of survival gnawed at him. Japan's surrender had turned everything he believed in upside down. He had been trained from adolescence to die for the emperor, to see surrender as the ultimate disgrace. Now surrounded by men who shared his disbelief, He struggled to understand what the word honor meant anymore. But there was something different about Kobayashi. Unlike many who refused to speak to their captors, he showed curiosity. When American guards mentioned the cowboy who had accepted his surrender, he listened intently. They told him the man's name, the state he came from, even the type of horse he rode. Kobayashi requested to send a letter, an unprecedented gesture for a POW. It was written in careful English, short and formal. It read simply, "To the man with the hat, thank you for seeing a man, not an enemy. I live because of your mercy." Months later, as Macready prepared to ship home, that letter reached his hands. He read it twice, then tucked it into his breast pocket. For the first time since the war ended, he allowed himself to smile. He had killed men he never saw, and watched friends vanish in fire. Yet here was a single human note cutting through the noise. The Army's psychological warfare branch later analyzed such exchanges, noting that compassion between former enemies accelerated reconciliation more effectively than propaganda. Historians would later describe these human encounters as micro-bridges, small moments that helped rebuild the moral architecture of two nations. Macready and Kobayashi had become an unwitting example. By 1948, both men had returned to civilian life. Macready went home to Abilene, Texas, to find his family ranch weathered but standing. He married his childhood sweetheart and rebuilt fences instead of fortifications. His horse Daisy grew old in the fields. Her saddle hung above the barn door. Neighbors often found Macready riding alone at dusk, humming old war songs, watching the sun melt over the horizon. Kobayashi's return was harder. Tokyo was a ruin. The city he remembered had been reduced to ashes by the B-29 raids. Yet amidst the wreckage, his wife and daughter waited miraculously alive. He took work as a mechanic for Japan Airlines, repairing American-built DC-3 transports under occupation supervision. Ironically, he spent his post-war years maintaining the engines of his former enemies. But he did so with quiet diligence, believing it a kind of atonement. As the years passed, their lives diverged, but their memory of that strange day refused to fade. In 1955, when Japan and the United States signed a new security treaty, veterans organizations began compiling stories of reconciliation. One report mentioned the pilot who surrendered to a cowboy. Editors dismissed it as apocryphal, too poetic to be real. Yet one journalist, an ex-Marine named Thomas Reeves, tracked down Macready's unit and confirmed the incident through surviving witnesses. The article appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, under the headline, "The Cowboy and the Zero." It was a modest piece, but it spread widely, even reaching Japan through translated clippings. Kobayashi read it in silence one evening, his hands trembling. His wife urged him to write again, and he did, this time more personal, expressing gratitude for the man who had shown him mercy when he least deserved it. The letter took months to arrive in Texas. When Macready opened it, he was sitting on the porch, the sky bruised with rain. He wrote back that same night. In 1957, 12 years after the war, they met again, this time in peace. Macready had been invited to Japan as part of a veterans' goodwill delegation. At Haneda Airport, among crowds of reporters and officials, a quiet man stepped forward, bowing low. Macready recognized him instantly despite the years. They shook hands. Neither spoke for several seconds. Cameras clicked, but the moment belonged to them alone. Kobayashi presented Macready with a small gift, a Model 0, carved from scrap aluminum, its propeller spinning with a gentle flick. Macready, in turn, offered something wrapped in faded cloth, the very sort he had kept safe since that day on Saipan. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the pilot accepted it, tears streaking his face. "This belongs to your family," Macready said softly. "It was never mine to keep." The image of a Marine cowboy returning a samurai sword became an emblem of post-war reconciliation. Newspapers in both countries printed it under headlines of forgiveness and respect. For veterans haunted by memories of brutality, it was a reminder that even in war, humanity could survive. Their meeting inspired a short documentary by American war correspondents in the late 1950s. It aired briefly on public television, narrated in sober tones over archival footage of Saipan's beaches. The closing line quoted Macready himself. "We were both just boys doing what we were told." The war ended. the day we stopped believing the other was less human. Kobayashi continued to work in aviation until retirement, teaching young mechanics the discipline of precision and respect for life. He told them that machines obey only their masters' hearts. If those hearts are blind, so is the machine. Macready, meanwhile, became something of a local legend in Abilene. Schoolchildren visited his ranch, listening to tales of the war told in a voice slow as molasses and deep as thunder. But he never glorified combat. He spoke instead of mercy, and how sometimes the bravest act is to hold fire. In 1963, when President Kennedy spoke of reconciliation between nations, he cited acts of simple grace by ordinary soldiers. Many believed he referred, at least in part, to the cowboy and the pilot. Whether or not he did, the phrase echoed their legacy. Years later, when Macready passed away, his family found the letters from Kobayashi bound in a bundle inside his desk drawer. The last one, dated 1972, read, "Because of you, my daughter has children who know peace. That is victory enough." Both men died never seeing themselves as heroes, yet historians now see their story as a mirror of a generation's moral. Awakening a quiet rebellion against the machinery of hate, their tale reminds us that wars end not only through treaties and surrenders, but through moments of unexpected grace. When a cowboy extended his hand to a lost pilot on a broken island, he proved that humanity could outlive ideology. Theirs was not a meeting of nations, but of souls, and as the Pacific winds still sweep over Saipan, whispering through the rusted skeletons of planes and the forgotten foxholes of soldiers, one might imagine a faint echo, the snort of a horse, the crackle of silence after decades of gunfire, and two men standing in the dust, each seeing for the first time not an enemy, but a fellow survivor. In that fragile instant, the world learned a truth greater than victory or defeat. Mercy is the final act of courage, and compassion the last weapon left standing when all others have failed.